All right. Good afternoon, everyone. If you're on the East Coast, if you are able to turn on your cameras, that would be wonderful. Just to vibe of people's faces in the room. If you're a facilitator, you know how this new Zoom space has been interesting for teaching and education when you can't hear people or get a sense of the room. So I am so excited you're here. This is Racial Literacy 101, Building Blocks for Equity Work. My name is Jessica Havens, and I will be facilitating this afternoon. This is really going to be lecture seminar style is what I was instructed to give. So it'll be about a 45-minute presentation followed by small group breakouts, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end, and we will finish up after about an hour and a half total. So before we get started, I would love if everyone could, I know you are coming from someplace and going someplace else. You may be trying to eat some late lunch. And we're just going to take a little space between where you were at before and where you're going next, just to try to be as present as possible in this. So if you're able to put both of your legs on the ground, I invite you to do that. Maybe push away from your desk. And just take a moment in between all of the craziness. And you can close your eyes or look at the ground softly. And we're just going to take a few quiet breaths just to sort of bring us into the space as we dive into thinking about racial equity and racial justice work. So take a deep breath in and a breath out. Just a few breaths on your own of quiet space in between probably your multiple meetings today. Take maybe one more breath. And then I invite you to open your eyes and come back in the space. So thank you for doing that with me. And without further ado, we're going to dive in. So there we are. So many of you probably looked me up on LinkedIn, or you can see my resume on my website. So my introduction of myself will include all the things that you don't put in those spaces, right? So this little blonde nerd here in the left-hand corner is myself in third grade. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and so much of my experience growing up on the south side of Chicago as a white kid in Black and brown communities informs my own personal identity, and often in a lot of what I bring to the professional space is doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work as a consultant and as a coach. And so this classroom is actually pretty diverse, right? So we have some Latino kids and Black kids, and there's like a few of us white kids. And then my high school experience was in mostly Black schools, with just a very small percentage, 5 to 7%, who were the rest. So the Asian, Latino, and white kids all sort of knew each other in these dominant Black spaces that I grew up in. And when I was younger, this created a big sort of, it was a big journey around identity for me and what that meant to be this white kid who had kind of a complicated multicultural identity. And that sort of, you know, connected into my professional world, moving into adulthood. So a few things about me outside of, again, you can read my full resume online, identify as being kind of what we might call as a hood nerd. So I grew up in the south side of Chicago. If you're familiar with Chicago, I grew up in South Shore, South Chicago, and then moved to Hyde Park in high school, which was a bit more middle class, mixed Black and white neighborhood as I got older. And I identify as being a fierce advocate for truth, justice, and recently added healing in on there. And so I grew up with a really strong sense around social justice and really feeling that that was my calling in the world, was to do that work. And then as I've gotten older, this notion of healing, which we don't often talk about in academic professional spaces as much, much really I brought that into the space of thinking about how so many people around gender, around race, around class, around all these pieces, how much healing is really needed in the world. And so outside of this presentation, I won't be talking about that, but that is my jam, is the intersections of healing, spirituality, and social justice. A passionate educator. I've been in education almost 17 years now in a multitude of roles. I would say working with the babies, the K-8 kids is probably my least amount of experience. So I have a lot of experience with high school. I was an adjunct professor and did variety of administrative work in the educational space, and then working with adults as well. And I love facilitation. And outside of my work, being a lover of dance, celebration, spirituality, and stand-up comedy is part of my therapy in this work. If you're a practitioner of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, you know that this work is insane. There's not a lot of people who want to be leading this work, right? You have kind of a bullseye on you in many ways if you are saying that this is what you do for work. And so stand-up comedy and laughter and dance are some of the ways that I cope with sort of the emotional burden of this work. And then I wanted to list here just some of my teachers, my lifelong teachers, even if they don't know they are my teachers. I'm not always great at connecting ideas that I feel like I've sort of developed over time with very specific, scholars that I've studied. But all of the people here influence my work, influence how I move through the world and how I think about equity, diversity, and inclusion and racial healing work. And so that's a little bit about me. The presentation flow for today is that we are going to, and it's going to be really short, right? I got about 40 minutes left, right, to really dive into a lot of work. What I was just sharing with some of the case organizers earlier, right, is that almost every slide in this presentation could be its own presentation on itself. It could be its own course, workshop, multi-year study group. And so we're attempting to do a whole lot in a very short period of time. So just know that it may feel like I'm rushing through concepts. I invite you, if there are any concepts here that feel very new to you, make a note of that. So it's great to have some pen and paper. This will not be an interactive presentation. And so just to take note of those areas that feel really new. Or if you're hearing something in a new way, some of you may already be experts in this work. I'm sure I have some fellow practitioners in the group. And so I invite you to bring in the lens of like an eternal learner. So you may already get privilege and oppression. You may already get some of these concepts, but maybe you hear a new way of speaking about it. Or you have some pushback or some questions that arise that you want to bring up during our Q&A at the end. So again, the beginning will be framing and naming the work. And then the second half will be really more focused on vocab and terminology. It's going to be really fast, right? It's going to be the fastest overview of systemic oppression, probably many of us have seen. And then we will close out, you'll go to breakout groups, and then we will do a Q&A. And a few other things, what did I want to share? I think that's it. I think we'll dive in. One of the pieces I will just say is that sort of regardless of what your own mix of identities are, is that if you're in this session and you're a leader in your organization and institution, it just means that you have access and privilege to shape the narrative of this work, right? And so my hope is that this session, even for those of you who are maybe more veteran in this work, that you get some new, I don't know, just little tidbits, even though this is a foundational sort of intro session for thinking about how we're doing this work moving forward. All right, so framing the work. Before I share the next slide, I'm going to do an educator thing. I'm not going to show you the slide yet because then you'll stop listening to me. So the next slide is you're going to see a bunch of quotes that I found on the internet from various higher ed institutions. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to give you time to actually read through the quotes. And I just want you to notice the difference in language choice. How do the differences in language choice affect your perception of the work? Or of this institution when we're thinking about DEI. I'm going to say DEI a lot, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as sort of our umbrella term today for this work. So just how does it affect your perception of the work? What do you notice as you're reading through these? Now, as you're reading these, I didn't place these in order of like good to bad or bad to good, just various examples of ways we're speaking about the work. And how we frame and name the work matters, and it often depends on the context of the institution or organization, right, that we're working within. This little clicking thing is acting funny. So a few, I want to just spend a little bit of time thinking about what is exactly that we are doing, right? And some of you may already have had these conversations at your institutions, and some of you may be in the process or you're leading them and you're trying to figure out where to start. So I just want to dive into a few different ways that this work is framed to just talk through the context of some of this language, right? So when we're thinking about diversity initiatives, I might argue that it's the lowest rung or like the baseline approach to thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And it's often the intro, conversation, right? So when often an organization or an institution or at school, they decide they need to do something about racism or some issues that are coming up around equity. The term diversity committee, diversity office is often like that first entry into the conversation. And often we use diversity initiatives to reference kind of some of those demographic or representational shifts, perhaps in leadership, increasing the amount of educators of color who are hired into tenured positions or who are hired into our school district. Sometimes there is a higher emphasis on representation as opposed to equity shifts in policy and practice. Or it might be like a culture night, for example, right? So representation matters. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but it's really the beginning of the conversation. Okay. And so when we move from diversity initiatives, then often we see this term diversity, equity, and inclusion. And some people, there is every version of this acronym, I, E, and D, D, E, and I, that doesn't really matter, right? So often diversity, equity, and inclusion is this umbrella term for how we talk about social justice on the institutional level. So how we are addressing social justice issues such as gender, sexuality, race, class, ability, religion, etc. It's often a really helpful umbrella term for the name of the office or the officer. And for institutions who have a little bit more political leeway, it might be possible for the work to be done under this umbrella of social justice, right? Social justice, similar to anti-racism and racial justice, has a bit more of an activist background. And then I think that institutional corporate translation of what that work is has become sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What we will notice in this work is that we're always balancing this desire to be really like authentic and truth-telling in what we do, but also institutionally strategic. How do we do both of those things, right? Because we are selling this work as well. We are marketing this. We want to bring people into the conversation. I always joke, right? It's very different to be like at a bar, if that ever happens again, or in a public place, someone says something racist or sexist and you call them out, right? And you can call them out in a way that sometimes is very different than if we are practitioners of this work for facilitating a workshop. And we really have to check our own emotional triggers, right? And be those facilitators and be strategic. How are we bringing folks into the conversation? And sometimes how we name and frame the work is related to that. When we see anti-racism and racial justice, I tend to associate that with a more of an activist framing of the work, right? So on the ground, social justice movements are going to use a lot more of that phrasing, anti-racism, racial justice. Sometimes if you have a diversity, equity, inclusion office, they might have a racial justice task force or a racial justice statement, right? That really is specifically about addressing race and racism and white supremacy on your campus, in your institution, et cetera. And then when we think about dismantling white supremacy or patriarchy, in my opinion, this is probably the most purest form of describing this work, even though it's way too politically edgy for most institutions to use this in their naming. So I put this on here not to suggest that we should necessarily be using this language to describe our work, but if you are leading this work, what I would say, it is vital that you have a deep I don't want to say comfortability, because these are like kind of horrible systems, but a deep understanding of how, when we do a workshop on microaggressions, that's how we're publicly naming it, that we can understand how that's deeply connected to dismantling white supremacy and patriarchy. And someone might also argue capitalism and some of these other systems that are prevalent when we're thinking about oppression and privilege. And so again, it's not necessary that you name it this, but if when you think of white supremacy, you only think of the KKK, as opposed to a larger system of beliefs and ideology and other pieces, then that would be a little note to yourself that this would be a good topic for you to dive into if you're leading this work. Just to have a grounding in the theory around both of these pieces would be very helpful. So we hear a lot about political correctness. So I'm going to give you a moment to read these two different cartoons. So both of these cartoons are critiques. One I might label the one on the left is from progressives, and the one on the right is from conservatives, right? But they're both engaged in this concept of political correctness. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I know this comes up on campuses quite a bit. And so when we look at the definition of political correctness, it says conforming to a belief that language and practices that could offend political sensibilities should be eliminated. And then someone who is politically correct believes that language and actions that could be offensive to others, right, should be avoided. These are great things, right? There's nothing wrong with political correctness and with the name there. As we're thinking about framing and naming this work, and if we're thinking about being strategic, right, is that we really want to focus on that we are creating inclusive and equitable caring institutions. That is our goal. Our goal is not about creating rules, right, around language, around these pieces, right, that people just need to adopt. And again, when I'm thinking about political correctness here, we're not talking about slurs, like words that are just straight up like awful, horrible words. We're talking about the difference between whether you're using minority, people of color, or BIPOC, for example, right? And the ways that we engage people in these conversations, we need to do that through education, dialogue, and engagement to understand the why, right? So that this work can be transformative. It is not about memorizing a set of words. It is that you should say or that you shouldn't say, right? There may be a little bit of that, but it's really like if we understand the why of why we shift our language, right, to be more empowering, to be more inclusive, that feels really different than creating what might be listed as, you know, like this list of no-nos or this list of yeses, right? So just a little side note that to me, like if we can avoid using political correctness as part of our goal, even if we know that's part of what we're doing, that may help strategically as we're framing this work. How we do the work matters as much as what we do. So some of these pieces, if you've studied leadership development and you run a department, you may be familiar with these. So I'm going to try to give these a very particular equity context, right? So you really do need a team. This work cannot reside on the shoulders of one person, and most especially not on one person of color in a predominantly white institution. But that's often what happens. And there may be multiple reasons. There's budget, right? We can hire one person, but burnout is often the result of that. And really, when we're thinking about this work, we need a holistic, multi-identity, multifaceted approach to thinking about this work. This presentation is really specifically about race and thinking about racial literacy. But as we're talking about equity work on a broader scale, right, we really need to be thinking more holistically around thinking about identity, oppression, and privilege. And so making sure that you have a team, and actually all three of these are related, right? The other piece is that relationships really matter. This was really given to me by anti-racist feminists, especially from the 1980s, but really attending to relationships that in traditional institutional culture, which tends to be more patriarchal, is that we diminish those pieces around relationship building. And just knowing that in equity work, And in the world that we live in that is so divided, and it's not just divided between left and right, it's divided even within like in groups, shall we say, is that this, and especially if we're on Zoom, it's really hard to like really see another person, right? And really trust them. And this work, you know, most of us who are practitioners of this work, this is like a personal calling. And we are not unaffected when we run a training and we get questions, right? We're triggered constantly, right? And there's so many ways that we can project onto others. So it's vital that you are building relationship building into your 40-hour work week, into how you are thinking about this work, into processing how a training went, into attending to the emotional selves of the people on your team who are really, especially if you have people who are doing the frontline work, which is doing workshops, and having to respond when we're thinking about all these pieces, is really like, what does it mean to build relationships? And then the other piece is like being prepared for pushback, which is why you need a team. When you have one person who has to somehow be the equity expert on all of the pieces, it's really like unfair, right? And that one team or that one little group or that one person is going to take the fall when something goes badly. And let me tell you, in equity work, something's going to go badly, okay? It's not a pessimistic view. It's just that this is really imperfect work. None of us are pure from the system, right? Even myself, I'm someone who, I'm as a white person growing up in communities of color. My current community is a multiracial community. I do this work professionally, and yet I am still being fed messages from society around all of these pieces. It is impossible for me to be, you know, perfect doing this work. And so anyone doing it should just be prepared for pushback from both the left and the right. And when you have a team, then you can kind of like problem solve as a group, and just that being just a really vital piece for survival, and also so that those of us doing this work don't experience burnout. So we're going to shift a little bit from the framing piece to an intro to vocab and terminology. This is going to be a very quick dive into some very big concepts around power, privilege, and systemic oppression. So when we think about privilege and oppression, you're going to note it. I'm going to speak about these in terms of our social identities rather than as people, because as people are a mixture of social identities. Many of us are a mixture of privilege and oppressed identities. And then we're all these other amazing, beautiful things outside of our social identities. So when we think about privileged dominant identities, one definition is social identities that are granted unearned systemic advantages or lack of barriers. And so a few things to note about how privilege functions, right? It operates on multiple levels. So I say the micro and the macro. Another way of thinking about multiple levels is that privilege operates on the interpersonal everyday level, right? So it might operate on like your interaction at the grocery store when you're in the checkout line, okay? And then we might think of the macro as impacting college admission, or thinking about property values and real estate, right? Thinking about these really large systems. So privilege operates on both levels, and so does oppression. It gives advantages and benefits to dominant identity groups, or just a lack of barriers, right? Which allows the person with that identity to sort of move through the world without maybe thinking about that part of their identity, right? So it might not be an extra privilege, it just might be a lack of barriers, a lack of policing, a lack of surveillance. Privilege is characteristically invisible to people who have it. Okay, there are exceptions to all of these pieces. You should just know that everything I'm saying, we can kind of poke holes in lots of pieces, right? That's what we do in this work, is we attempt to categorize lots of pieces, and then we challenge some of those categories. But it's often invisible to people who have it, and very visible to those who do not. And it often takes concrete study to be able to see the ways that, for example, as a white person, how my whiteness impacts my day-to-day life. It might take me extra effort to see that, whereas it may be extra visible to folks of color. Privileges are unearned, and they are granted to people in the dominant groups, whether they want them or not, and regardless of their stated intent, right? So stated intent is, I am a good person, okay? I am a good person, right? And my intentions are good. that alone is not enough to get rid of privilege. Or I have worked hard. That alone does not, both and is sort of a great way to think about these pieces. All these things are operating at the same time. And when we think about oppressed or targeted identities, they are social identities that face systemic barriers, exploitation, and often increased violence. Again, this operates on multiple levels. So the interpersonal, everyday, the relational level, as well as the systemic. And then target identities are often, and the word often is important here, right? Because we don't want to have blanket statements on anything, are often subjected to more exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. Targets of oppression are often kept in place by dominant ideology, which supports oppression by denying that it exists and blaming the conditions of oppression on the oppressed. Okay. Another way of thinking about that piece is, for example, if we think about, I'll use a gender example here, right? When we think about sexual assault and this notion of like blaming the victim, what was this person wearing? That is an exact example here of blaming the conditions of oppression on the oppressed, right? So we're not looking at rape culture and why do we have a culture that means it's unsafe for women to walk around however they feel like walking around, right? Is that we then focus on the victim. And this is the same, it could be like, why are poor people poor? And if the answer to that is because they didn't work hard, right? Blaming the conditions of oppression on the oppressed, right? And so it works with, when we think about oppression, it works on an ideological level as well. That requires what we would call decolonization, right? To rid ourselves of dominant ideologies of goodness and badness, right? Of worth and all of these pieces. And then privilege is often more visible to those with oppressed identities. W.E. Du Bois talks about this notion of dual or double consciousness. And he was specifically talking about Black people in the United States as, because their survival, they had to be able to navigate white spaces and be able to do so safely, is that they developed like a double, what we would call double consciousness around having to navigate both one's own community as well as what we would call the dominant or mainstream community that has systemic power, and needing to know how to do that both strategically for thinking about power and money and all those pieces, but also for senses of safety. The same thing you can go when you think about women, right? Is developing this consciousness of being able to survive in a men's world, shall we say, as well as in our own like group. And so, and again, these are all often, the word often is really important here, right? But it's often more visible when you have an oppressed identity around how that's functioning in your life and in the world than it is when you have a privileged identity. So this chart here, people have seen, I'm sure, all types of versions of this chart. This simplifies it a lot, but just a few things to note on this. Under race, where it says white, I did add white passing and light skin to this chart. Because one does not necessarily have to identify as white to receive what we might call light skin privilege or white passing privilege, right? So one could identify as being a mixed race person, one could identify as being a person of color based on their ancestry, but really moves through the world as more what we might call white passing. And so I included that in the privileged identities. Everything's on a spectrum, as opposed to only someone who personally identifies as white, right? And then a few other pieces about this chart. What I would say about this chart is that it's very specific to the United States and it's specific to the present moment, right? So our goal in doing DEI work is to shift this chart. Okay, so some charts of existence we can say are stagnant and they exist always, right? This is a very political chart. This is based on oppression and privilege. This is not based on like permanent characteristics of any one group on here. And a few other pieces too to just note is that their social identities are not the totality of our human experience. Okay, so I always give this little speech is like, on one hand, right, we are all of these social identities. I'm a mixture of my race and my gender and my religion and my social class and my age on one hand, and all of the the stuff that comes with that. And on the other hand, I am this beautiful, unique manifestation of whatever you want to call it, the human experience or spirits, right? God, energy, matter, whatever you consider that to be. There's no one like me on the planet, right? And then in addition to that, I share all these commonalities with the human species, okay? And so we have this combination of uniqueness, of similarities, of differences that inform who we are. And I think it's really important to say that with this chart. The other piece that I want to just share is for us to be really careful not to take a paternalistic view of this chart, right? So for example, I could have multiple of these privileged identities on here and still feel depressed and still feel not happy with my life, shall we say, right? And I could have multiple oppressed identities and feel a real sense of resilience and pride in those spaces where I may have experienced challenge and struggle, right? And so to be really careful that we don't necessarily look at oppressed identities, again, in this paternalistic sense, and not equate privilege and oppression with happiness and with sense of self and with pride and with resiliency. That this is, we're really thinking about the ways that our systems of privilege and oppression have sort of set us up in this way and how they impact our lives, whether or not they have given us ease, more ease, or they have caused, you know, the most benign, on the most benign level that they have, you know, impacted us negatively, or in more serious, in a very violent way, right? In terms of thinking about colonization and imperialism and pieces like that. And what else did I want to say about this list? Oh, thinking about intersectionality. Some of you all may have heard of the term of intersectionality. I'm going to just share the sort of how the term originally came to be and how we're using it now in this work, and not really putting any judgment on that. But so Kimberly Crenshaw was a Black feminist critical race theorist from the 1980s, and she coined this term intersectionality. And originally the term intersectionality was based on a court case. And intersectionality came out of this notion is that they were attempting, Black women were a part of this court case, and they were attempting to separate out like Blackness, like race, right? And then womanness and gender in this space. And when she made this argument, she said, you know, there is a uniqueness of being a Black woman, right? And that this notion of having multiple, what we might say, oppressed social identities has a compounding impact that is unique to being a Black woman. And you can't necessarily separate out those two pieces. And so that's sort of where the term intersectionality came from. Where I see it being used in DEI work is this notion that all of us are a mixture of multiple identities, right? And so when we're looking at, say, a social issue that's happening on campus or in the world, is when we say we want to take an intersectional lens to looking at it, it means, how we're using it now, it means what does this look like from the lens of gender? How is gender playing out right now? How is gender and race playing out right now? How is class playing out right now? Like, what's up with religion? What's up with, you know, class or ability? And so that's really how it's the sort of the origin of the word, and then how we are engaging with intersectionality presently. And any of these terms on here that you don't understand, just take a note of them. Like this is the type of information that's really easy for you to research on your own. Doesn't require asking a lot of folks about it. I will just reference that I use I say Latino a lot. It's not because I'm ignorant of the phrase Latinx. Just know that there's an ongoing conversation around Latinx. Sort of came out as looking for a gender neutral way to talk about Latin American and Latino people without it being like a masculine ending of the word. But there is conversation in Latin America around the fact that Latinx is really English dominant, right? So Latinx is not phonetic or pronounceable in Spanish. And so there is, and language is always evolving. I'm a linguist, it's part of my background. And just know it's always evolving, and there's always conversations, right? Political conversations about this. And so if you use Latinx, that is sort of like the going term in the United States right now, but just know that there is a sort of political conversation happening in our larger hemisphere around some of this language. And so if I use Latino, it's not, I don't want to offend anyone. It's just, it tends to be how I speak, but just know Latinx is sort of considered the going term right now in the United States. So moving from these pieces, I really want to dive into systemic oppression. And in this case, we'll be talking about systemic racism. And so there's a few definitions I have here for systemic oppression. I'll let you read this first one, and then we're going to focus on the second one after this. So some people distinguish between institutional and systemic oppression. For the purposes of our presentation today, I'll just leave them together. It occurs when established laws, customs, and practices systematically reflect and produce inequities based on one's membership in targeted social identity groups. The second sentence here is really important. If oppressive consequences accrue due to institutional laws, customs, or practices, the institution is oppressive whether or not the individuals maintaining those practices have oppressive intentions, okay? This is vital to understand, that we don't have to have a big, bad, racist, sexist person at the head of an institution or organization or department, right, for inequity, for our institution to be churning out inequities, as Shakti Butler says, right? Is that if we have a history of oppression, okay? So if we do nothing at all, we continue to churn out those inequities. And so it really requires a very clear pivoting, right, to counter that messaging, to counter those laws and practices. I remember I used to work for Jeffco Public Schools in Colorado, and I learned so much there. And I remember having a coworker who shared with me, and she was really a white woman, progressive, you know, took her kids to protests and things like that. Her 7th grader comes home, and like she hears her 7th grader uttering the N-word. And she loses her mind, you know, because she's like, they would never have heard that in my house. And like, she's someone I believe they would never have heard that in her house. And what we don't realize around socialization is how much outside messaging our children, our students, our colleagues are getting. And so if we are not being intentional about having that conversation, those things seep in, right? Whether or not they align with our belief system or not. I did come up with a diagram here for another presentation I did. So unfortunately, this was a really easy diagram for me to create. I was trying to create a visual for what we mean by systemic oppression, right? So this notion that systemic oppression involves this intermixing of all these different systems, right? So I come out of the educational system. So one of the questions we're always trying to solve in public education is, why are, you know, Black seniors, right? Why are their test scores lower than their white peers, right? These are like some of the eternal questions around how we're, you know, I might question how we even measure success. That's a whole other thing, right? I think we should just redo the whole system, but that's my opinion. But creating this list here was unfortunately very easy, right, to come up with. But it shows how, when we talk about systemic oppression, it's not a simple answer, right? It's all these different systems that impact what happens at school. And not only does it create systemic oppression, but it creates the other side, which is systemic entitlement, systemic privilege, right? Any of these pieces, you can look at sort of both sides of the piece. If you look at property taxes and history of redlining, right? Sometimes it's easier for us to see what discrimination or oppression looks like, and a lot more difficult to say, well, what's the other side of that? The other side of that is like in the city of Chicago, where I'm from, right? The suburbs of Chicago, schools are funded by property taxes, right? And you think about, well, why does this suburban school have all this money? Why does the suburban school have, you know, this state-of-the-art swimming pool and STEM lab and all these pieces, right? So when we think about oppression, we also have the other side of the coin, that both of those things are happening simultaneously, okay? And so when we're thinking about doing institutional, coming back, sorry, to the DEI work, right? We need to be doing, we need to be addressing a workshop on microaggressions, right? Or courageous conversations on race with our colleagues simultaneously while we're doing systemic equity work at our institution. So we might be addressing the wage gap between, you know, this might be a taboo between the highest paid employee and then your hourly employees, right, who work at the cafeteria or the coffee shop, right? That is an equity issue. So even though that's involving more like class issues, right? And so when we're thinking about DEI work, it's important for us to do the micro as well as thinking about the macro. What are some of these pieces that really require laws and legislation and shifts in practice for us to, you know, change the outcome? And the other piece to note too is when you start thinking about systemic oppression is that anyone of any identity can uphold or propagate a system of oppression or liberation. Okay? Anyone of any identity can uphold or propagate a system of oppression or liberation. And again, and so just to be careful that if we are not really looking at our bylaws and our institutional structures, right, representation can only shift the needle so much if it is not backed up by real institutional change. With that, a few final thoughts, just to recap here, is the personal is political is professional. This was like a feminist slogan in the 70s. I added to it and I added professional, right? The whole reason I have that there is just for us to understand that our personal lives are connected to our professional lives, right? What is happening with our children in our schools, in the outside world, with what's happening in the government, with what is happening in our institution on a day-to-day level, all of those things are connected. And for us to be successful at this work, it's really helpful to hold the humanity of our staff and our colleagues and the students that we work with as part and parcel of the work that we do. Again, representation is only the tip of the iceberg. And I don't mean to keep harping on this so that we skip the representation part. That's not what I'm saying. But really, when we think about DEI, it's only the D in the DEI work, right? And really thinking about what does equity look like on an institutional level. It is vital to address patriarchy and engage anti-racist feminisms in our work, particularly if you are a male identified leader in this session right now. And I will ask you to, even as part of the race work, anti-racism work, to really reflect on the ways that gender and patriarchal structures in your institution and your leadership intersect with racial justice work and how it intersects with the work that you do. And, you know, people talk about like feminism without anti-racism, right? We also, this is my argument, is we can't have anti-racism without feminism, and really understanding how we can bring multiple tools together if we understand that oppression is connected, right? And that all of these pieces, even if race is our focal point, are connected. And then just addressing the interpersonal as well as the systemic is really vital to the work. A few keywords. I just came up with this list. This is not some official list from anyone else. If you are curious, what are some theories I should know about? What is some work I should study? I just made a list of some keywords. And if any of these keywords, as you're looking at this, feel really unfamiliar, or you're like, what is that? Go ahead and write it down and find a workshop on it, right? Write a book that's written about it. These are all things, if you're doing this work, a practitioner, you don't need to be experts on every single one of these topics, but this is a pretty good baseline of like some of the theoretical underpinnings that is helpful for understanding these larger systems. And then our fun job is to figure out, how do you translate that in a 45-minute workshop? Or how do you translate that for a 20-year-old? Or how do you translate that, right, for your upper leadership who maybe is brand new to this work, right? But again, this would be for practitioners of the work. And some of my fave books, they do not include any of the newest books from the last few years that I know that have come out and they're like all the rage around anti-racism. These are books that were foundational in my learning. The top ones are ones that I use for teaching, both college courses as well as Paul Kivel's Uprooting Racism I've used with white anti-racist affinity group work. So white people really wanting to dive into anti-racism work with white people without having to rely on the emotional labor of folks of color. And then the bottom three books are more books that have been foundational in my understanding. Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The Case for Reparations. If you are new to the reparations conversation, it's really a foundational piece. It's long, It's like 20, 25 pages, but it's worth reading. And then Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark. It's one of Toni Morrison's only nonfiction pieces. And Playing in the Dark, she talks about the canon of literature. So if there's any English teachers out there or people who are working with a humanities department, Toni Morrison's piece is brilliant for really looking at the ways that whiteness, like in our literary imagination, has been constructed, and how these like figures of these books from our childhood and early learning impact our notions of race. So those are just a few pieces. If you would like to find out more about me and my work, this is a very short presentation. I do organizational consulting. I love doing longer term partnerships with a cohort or a board or a group of leaders to do educational capacity building. And then I also do coaching with institutional leaders. So people who are wanting someone to call and process equity issues with, or their own learnings. And, you know, a workshop may feel too vulnerable. Like, I do a lot of coaching. So I love doing that work. Thank you so much.